Scrum Master Success. Scrum Artifacts and Scrum Events. Scrum Artifacts. Scrum's artifacts represent work or value. They are designed to maximize transparency of key information. Thus, everyone inspecting them has the same basis for adaptation. These artifacts are Product Backlog. This is the document which contains the overall list of requirements and features to make the product. Sprint Backlog. This is the document which contains items the team has selected for the sprint. It contains a small subset of the items selected from the product backlog. Increment. An increment is the outcome/deliverable of a sprint. It is the finished/completed piece of work you get at the end of a sprint. Each artifact contains a commitment to ensure that it provides information that enhances transparency and focus against which progress can be measured. For the product backlog, it is the product goal. For the sprint backlog, it is the sprint goal. For the increment, it is the definition of done. These commitments exist to reinforce empiricism and the Scrum values for the Scrum team and their stakeholders. Product Backlog. The product backlog is an emergent, ordered list of what is needed to improve or create the product. It is the single source of work undertaken by the Scrum team. Product backlog items that can be done by the Scrum team within one sprint are deemed ready for selection in a sprint planning event. They usually acquire this degree of transparency after refining activities. Product backlog refinement is the act of breaking down and further defining product backlog items into smaller, more precise items. This is an ongoing activity to add details, such as a description, order, and size. Attributes often vary with the domain of work. The developers who will be doing the work are responsible for the sizing. The product owner may influence the developers by helping them understand and select trade-offs. The commitment of the product backlog is the product goal. The product goal describes a future state of the product, which can serve as a target for the Scrum team to plan against. The product goal is in the product backlog. The rest of the product backlog emerges to define what will fulfill the product goal. A product is a vehicle to deliver value. It has a clear boundary, known stakeholders, well-defined users or customers. A product could be a service, a physical product, or something more abstract. The product goal is the long-term objective for the Scrum team. They must fulfill or abandon one objective before taking on the next. The sprint backlog is composed of the sprint goal. The sprint backlog contains a set of product backlog items, selected for the sprint, as well as an actionable plan for delivering the increment. The sprint backlog is a plan by and for the developers. It is a highly visible, real-time picture of the work that the developers plan to accomplish during the sprint, in order to achieve the sprint goal. Consequently, the sprint backlog is updated throughout the sprint, as more is learned. The progress of the sprint backlog is also inspected in the daily Scrum. The commitment of the sprint backlog is the sprint goal. The sprint goal is the single objective for the sprint. Although the sprint goal is a commitment by the developers, it provides flexibility in terms of the exact work needed to achieve it. The sprint goal also creates coherence and focus, encouraging the Scrum team to work together rather than on separate initiatives. The sprint goal is created during the sprint planning event, and then added to the sprint backlog. As the developers work during the sprint, they keep the sprint goal in mind. If the work turns out to be different than they expected, they collaborate with the product owner to negotiate the scope of the sprint backlog within the sprint, without affecting the sprint goal. Increment. An increment is a concrete stepping stone toward the product goal. Each increment is additive to all prior increments and thoroughly verified, ensuring that all increments work together. In order to provide value, the increment must be usable. Multiple increments may be created within a sprint. Increments are presented at the sprint review, thus supporting empiricism. An increment may be delivered to stakeholders prior to the end of the sprint as needed. Therefore, the sprint review should never be considered a gate to releasing value. Work cannot be considered part of an increment, unless it meets the definition of done. The commitment of the increment is the definition of done. The definition of done is a formal description of the state of the increment, when it meets the quality measures required for the product. The moment a product backlog item meets the definition of done, an increment is born. Therefore, when a user story meets the definition of done, it becomes an increment. The definition of done creates transparency, by providing everyone a shared understanding of what work was completed as part of the increment. If a product backlog item does not meet the definition of done, it cannot be released or even presented at the sprint review. Instead, it returns to the product backlog for future consideration. If the definition of done for an increment is part of the standards of the organization, all Scrum teams must follow it as a minimum. If it is not an organizational standard, the Scrum team must create a definition of done that is appropriate for the product. The developers are required to conform to the definition of done. If there are multiple Scrum teams working together on a product, they must mutually define and comply with the same definition of done. Scrum events. Scrum contains 4 formal events, which are contained within a bigger event, called a sprint. The events within the sprint are Sprint, Sprint Planning, Daily Scrum, Sprint Review, and Sprint Retrospective. Sprint. The sprint is a fixed period of time, where a specific amount of work is completed. Sprints can also be considered as cycles of work where the product is developed over multiple iterations. The sprint is the bigger event, within which all the other Scrum events are contained. Sprint Planning. A sprint starts with a sprint planning meeting. In this meeting, the Scrum team chooses what they will work on during the sprint. In other words, this is where the Scrum team selects the product features they will make for the current sprint. Daily Scrum. As the name suggests, the Daily Scrum is a day-to-day meeting, where the development team discusses the progress of the project. It gives the development team a chance to evaluate, adjust and adapt their plan for the upcoming work. Sprint Review. The Sprint Review meeting is an opportunity to check and evaluate the work done in the sprint. It is attended by the Scrum team and different stakeholders, for example, clients and senior management. The Scrum team gives a product demo to customer and receives feedback on the work they have completed so far. Sprint Retrospective. Lastly, in the Sprint Retrospective meeting, the Scrum team evaluates its own performance and suggests improvements to increase their effectiveness for future sprints. Thank you for watching and subscribing.